Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Chris, co producer and editor of The Last Architect of Eterra. In the first two episodes, we talked about the world of Eterra and about Aelit as the emotional center of the story. But today, I want to do something different. I want to step back from summary. I want to step back from analysis. And I want to spend this episode inside the actual language of the book because sometimes that is the best way into a story like this, not by explaining it from the outside, but by entering it through sound, atmosphere, pressure, and image. The opening of The Last Architect of Eterra does not ease you in gently. It does not open on comfort. It does not open on orientation. It opens on corrosion, dread, machinery concealment, and the sense that the world itself has been wounded for a very long time. And more than that, it opens on the moment that shaped Aelit, the moment that taught her what survival meant in Eterra, the moment that taught her what silence costs. So, for this episode, I'm going to read from the prologue. And I want you to hear what the book is doing at the level of breath and texture, the smell of the lower tiers, the pressure of the workshop, the downward architecture of Sector Zero, the terror in Alit's body, the tuning fork, the Wardens, the terrible logic of perfect order. This is not just scene setting. This is the emotional code of the whole story being written into the very first pages. You can hear even from the beginning that this is a world where nothing truly disappears. Things are buried, suppressed, hidden, crushed down under systems, under fear, under doctrine, under steel and rust and concrete. But not gone, never really gone. And that matters because Alit herself begins as someone who has learned to survive by making herself small, by hiding, by staying quiet, by mastering the art of not being noticed. This prologue gives us the origin of that survival instinct. It shows us the wound before it becomes method. It shows us the fear before it becomes identity. And it shows us the first contact between a child and the machinery of a world built to hollow people out. So that is what we're doing today. I'm going to read the opening. I'm going to let the book speak in its own voice, and I want you to listen not only for plot, but for atmosphere, for the way silence works in this world, for the way matter itself seems exhausted, for the way fear changes the body, for the way Eterra feels less like a backdrop and more like a living wound. So, here is the prologue. Prologue, perfect silence, and rain in the lower tiers always smelled of rust and ancient dust. It brought no freshness with it. It slid down the walls in reddish streaks, seeped into the lungs like a heavy residue, and left on the lips the bitter tang of oxidized iron. In the hidden workshop buried at the forgotten edge of the Omega 11 factory, that taste mingled with the sharpness of rosin, the metallic bitterness of melting solder, and something else besides, something faintly sour, faintly organic, as though the world itself had been cut open. It was the smell of Eterra's exposed flesh, rising from the places where the concrete had long ago surrendered and crumbled back into the raw body of the planet. The walls of the workshop were rough beneath the hand, layered upon themselves like the skin of some diseased old beast paint. Rust, another skin of paint, then mildew blooming in the cracks. If one pressed an ear against the overhead supports, one could hear it afar off, whomp, deep, thrum, rhythmic and patient, like the heartbeat of something vast enough to dwarf thought itself. Those were the overseer's forges, laboring dozens of levels below. And beneath the forges, still farther down where no honest sound should have reached, silence began. Not ordinary silence, but the true kind. The kind even machines feared. The Omega 11 plant was the perfect place to disappear. The groaning of dead presses, the endless vibration of ancient engines, and the mass of twisted scrap metal generated such a violent electromagnetic haze that Alit's unstable magic was swallowed whole by the machinery's pulse. She did not feel that cold on her skin. She felt it deep in the marrow, as though frost had learned to live inside the bones. It was not the clean cruelty of winter, but an emptiness that drew life itself from the air. If she lost control for even an instant, a film of white would bloom across the copper tubing of her workbench. She was an anomaly, a flaw in the Inquisition's perfect design, and the fear of her own power burned more fiercely in her than any living fire. Sector Zero lived by the law of entropy. The city here did not rise, it burrowed. It chewed downward into the earth in layers of rusted iron and exhausted stone, as though it wished to hide from the sky forever. Somewhere far above, beyond the endless lattice of drainage pipes and corroded support columns, the weavers lived in heights no one here would ever touch. Down below, sunlight had become a story told by madmen and believers. The streets were not truly streets at all, only narrow fissures between factory blocks, drowned in stagnant fog where the dim lights of patrol drones flickered and vanished like dying thoughts. In a world such as this, survival belonged only to those who mastered silence. Aelit had learned that 10 years ago, on the night she lost everything. 10-year-old Aelit sat beneath a heavy oak workbench, her arms locked around her knees so tightly they ached. She was trembling. The cold of the stone floor climbed her legs with patient fingers, but the true source of her shaking came from deeper within. A high, needling whine filled her ears, sharp enough to split thought in two. It was the surest sign that the spark in her blood had awakened and was feeding on animal terror. Her stomach clenched so violently with nausea that she thought she might be sick onto the floor. Her father did not waste time on comfort. His hands, twisted and ridged with old burns, moved quickly over a heavy object of golden alloy, adjusting something within its two long prongs. A tuning fork. Even now it gave off a faint and living warmth, ancient as the buried ruins beneath the city, as though it had slumbered in darkness for centuries, waiting for the touch of human fear. "They detected the surge, Ali," he said, his voice low and flat, never lifting his eyes from the artifact. "This won't be a routine patrol. The Wardens are coming." The lid clamped her jaw shut so hard it hurt, just to keep herself from crying out. In Sector Zero, people spoke of the Wardens only in whispers, and even then with the shame of those who feared being overheard by the walls themselves. They did not leave bodies behind. Bodies were merciful. Bodies could be buried, wept over, remembered. The Wardens left order, perfect order. They scraped out the human core and left behind something obedient, polished, and useful, another flawless component in the city's endless machine. "I'll draw them away. You disappear." He dropped to one knee before her and pressed the tuning fork into her hands. At first, the metal burned with a cold so intense it felt like injury. Then, almost at once, it turned warm. The shrill ringing in her ears died in an instant, replaced by a surge of dizziness so sudden and fierce she nearly dropped the thing. The artifact had drawn her magic into itself. She felt it happen, felt the violent pressure leave her blood, only to gather, contained and waiting, inside the golden metal. "Become nothing, Ali. Become dust in the cracks. No matter what you hear, do not look at them. Do not reach for the spark." He rose at once sharp and sudden, and placed himself between her hiding place and the door, his body filling the narrow gap beneath the workbench like a living shield. The heavy iron door did not explode from its hinges. It simply began to forget that it was a door. The metal softened and then came apart into gray powder, spilling soundlessly to the floor as though the material itself had chosen surrender over resistance. In the opening that remained there were no faces, no eyes, nothing recognizably human, only many angled figures wrapped in ash-colored cloaks. their outlines shifting slightly as though space could not fully agree on where they began or ended. They did not step into the room, they flowed into it, and with them came a dead cold so completely it seemed to unmake the air. The dripping water from the ceiling fell silent. The weak emergency lamp dulled, as though the room had been emptied not only of warmth, but of its very ability to remember color. The presence of the overseer did not crush, it hollowed. It pressed upon everything with the weight of absolute silence. Her father did not reach for a weapon. Common metal was useless against such things. Instead, he flung his arms wide, and the air around him cracked open. A dense orange flare of primal spark burst from his chest and lashed across the room. Violent and ancient, not like fire, but like the first memory of fire. It struck one of the figures hard, enough to make it stagger. Heat seared Elit's cheek even from where she hid. The room filled with the smell of ozone and scorched blood, with the terrible rawness of power dragged into the world without permission. But the second warden did not hesitate. It slipped through the orange blaze as though the shield were only smoke, as though resistance belonged to a lesser order of reality. A hand in a gray glove came to rest upon her father's forehead. The spark did not go out, it folded inward. Her father let out one short, broken breath, and his shoulders sank at once, as though some invisible architecture within him had collapsed. Aelit, frozen in mute horror, watched his face begin to change. The stubborn line of his jaw dissolved. The fine lines beside his eyes vanished. The gaze that had always been sharp and warm and ungovernably alive became smooth, level, and empty. It was like watching water poured out of a vessel, leaving the shape behind but not the living thing it had once held. The wardens receded as they had entered, flowing back into the corridor with the same terrible composure. Threat removed. Anomaly corrected. Color returned first, then sound. The room remembered itself by degrees. Her father sank slowly to his knees. One hand moved over the floor in a blind and searching motion until it found a fallen wrench. He picked it up. He placed it on the workbench with measured precision, perfectly parallel to the edge. Then he stood and walked from the room in calm, even steps, without once turning his head toward the place where his daughter was hidden. The morning shift would not wait. Aelit remained behind in the freezing silence. The tuning fork in her hands began to fill with a fierce golden light. Resonance answered the storm of her terror, pulsing harder and harder, asking to be struck, asking to shatter the walls, the room, the whole world if need be. Become dust. A child's mind could not contain such loss. It could not give it language, could not bear it in any recognizable form. She stumbled backward on instinct alone, tore aside a rusted mesh screen, and squeezed herself into the narrow stone throat of an abandoned air duct. She crawled through total darkness, choking on dust so thick it clung to the inside of her mouth and nose, scraping her elbows raw against the walls. At the ragged edge of consciousness, through tears and suffocation and blind panic, her father's words surfaced from some earlier evening. He had spoken them softly, perhaps thinking she was already asleep. A quarantine isn't a prison, Ellie, it's armor. Out there, beyond all this, there is something for which our living planet is a signal fire in the dark. She had not understood him then. Now she did not want to. The tuning fork's light pulsed hotter, burning her fingers. It had become impossibly heavy, as though it were gathering not only her power, but the full weight of the moment itself. Her cramped hands twitched. For one fatal heartbeat, her grip failed. The golden metal slipped from her palms. Aelit gasped and lunged after it, but too late. The tuning fork fell into the black vertical shaft. Below, a dull metallic clang rose from the darkness as it struck the protective grate over the collector channel only a few levels down. Then the golden light vanished. Aelit knew that place. Below, just beyond that shaft, stood an Inquisition checkpoint. 10 years had passed since that night. Aelit survived by changing digital identities the way other people changed worn gloves, slipping in and out of stolen records, dead names, forgotten profiles, hiding behind the ghosts of citizens who no longer existed in any meaningful way. For 10 years, she had lived by the schedule of machines. Her meager diet consisted of tasteless gray ration bricks. Her only true possession, her only relic of a life before silence, was her father's old jacket, the one with the frayed collar, still carrying a scent that felt almost obscene in a place like this. Not smoke, not rust. Something floral, something soft, almost tender, almost impossible. Her mother had left when Aelit was 3 years old, leaving behind nothing but that trace of perfume in the rough fabric. A ghost her father had, and that is where we're going to pause for today. What I love about this opening is how completely it commits to the world before it asks anything from the reader. You can feel the corrosion in it. You can feel the downward weight of the city. You can feel the difference between ordinary fear and the larger, colder thing that rules this place. And more than anything, you can feel the emotional logic of Alit's life being formed in real time. This is where silence stops being an idea and becomes a survival command. This is where hiding becomes instinct. This is where the tuning fork stops being an object and becomes inheritance, terror and buried power all at once. And this is where the Wardens become unforgettable. Not because they are loud, not because they are theatrical, but because they are so precise, so calm, so absolute. They do not simply destroy, they empty, they correct, they leave order behind. That is one of the most frightening ideas in the whole book. And you can hear it landing here in the very first pages. You can also hear something else. You can hear that the story is already larger than the room it begins in. The mention of quarantine, the living planet, the signal fire in the dark, the sense that what is happening to Aelit is personal, but not only personal. There is something larger waiting beyond the edge of her understanding, something older, something buried, something that the world of Eterra has not fully silenced. And that is why this prologue works so well as a beginning. It gives you trauma, yes. It gives you atmosphere, yes. But it also gives you scale. It tells you that this is a story about a damaged child in a broken world. And also a story about forces much older and much bigger than the structures pretending to control that world. Next time, I'll continue with the next section and stay with this opening movement a little longer because there is still so much happening here in terms of memory, identity, fear, and the first shape of Aelit's life in hiding. I'm Chris. Thank you for listening.